We've all come across them. Those people who stride through conversations, meetings, or social media threads with an air of certainty that seems wildly out of sync with their actual knowledge. That co-worker who derails an entire strategy session with confidently flawed suggestions. That relative who transforms into a self-proclaimed expert on climate change after watching a single documentary. That stranger in a comment section arguing with someone who spent decades studying the very topic they're dismissing. What gives rise to this curious gap between how much people know and how much they think they know? The root of this psychological puzzle lies in a phenomenon first uncovered in the late 90s by two researchers who couldn't ignore a growing pattern in human behavior. Back in 1999, psychologists David Dunning and Dunning-Kruger conducted a study that would not only shift the landscape of social psychology, but become a cultural touchstone for understanding intellectual self-deception. They identified a strange cognitive glitch. Those with the least amount of skill or knowledge in a given field often believe they're far more capable than they are. And inversely, those who are genuinely skilled often downplay their abilities. The term we now use to describe this cognitive distortion? The Dunning-Kruger effect. As David Dunning once quipped, the first rule of the Dunning-Kruger Club is that you don't realize you're in it. This bias, as unsettling as it is universal, affects nearly everyone to some degree. It blinds us to our blind spots. Today we're going to dig deep into what this phenomenon really means, not just as an abstract concept, but as a force that shapes decisions, influences relationships, and determines how we interpret ourselves and others. We'll explore how it was discovered, how it functions, what it looks like in everyday life, and crucially, how to start catching ourselves when we fall into its trap. The story begins in 1995, not in a lab, but at a bank in Pittsburgh. A man named MacArthur Wheeler walked confidently into two banks, committed robberies in broad daylight, and left without even attempting to disguise himself. Later that same evening, he was arrested. Surveillance footage had clearly recorded his face, and when shown the footage, Wheeler was baffled. He genuinely believed he was invisible to the cameras. His reasoning? He'd smeared his face with lemon juice, assuming that because lemon juice can make ink invisible on paper, it would do the same to his appearance on security footage. It sounds absurd, but that absurdity was precisely what caught David Dunning's attention. What fascinated him wasn't just Wheeler's mistake. It was his complete and utter confidence in it. That kind of assured ignorance sparked a question in Dunning's mind. How can someone be so far off base in their thinking, and yet so sure they're right? He partnered with Dunning-Kruger, and together they set out to explore whether this wasn't just a one-off case, but a broader psychological trend. In their first major study, they tested participants on skills like logical reasoning, grammar, and humor. After taking the tests, each person was asked to estimate how well they thought they had done compared to their peers. The results were startling. The individuals who scored lowest on the actual tests believed they had done far better than they had, some even placing themselves in the top half of performers, despite landing near the very bottom. In contrast, those who scored near the top tended to underestimate how well they had done, assuming others must have performed similarly or even better. What Dunning and Kruger had uncovered was a dual problem. Those lacking competence also lacked the awareness of what true competence even looked like. In short, the same knowledge required to do something well is also what allows you to judge whether it's being done well. When that knowledge is missing, the ability to see your own shortcomings vanishes with it. This creates what researchers now refer to as a double ignorance. You not only perform poorly, but you're unaware of how poorly you're performing. At the heart of the Dunning-Kruger effect is a blind spot in metacognition, the ability to reflect on and evaluate your own thinking. Without this skill, It's incredibly easy to believe you're smarter, more capable, or more informed than you truly are. And what's worse, this illusion can be astonishingly resilient, persisting even in the face of contradictory evidence. Several psychological tendencies feed this illusion. One is a lack of awareness about the true scope of a skill or body of knowledge. When people step into a new domain, they often don't know just how much they don't know. That ignorance of the broader picture breeds false confidence. If you've only seen one puzzle piece, it's easy to believe you see the whole image. Another factor is confirmation bias. Once we've formed a belief about our capabilities, we subconsciously filter the world to confirm it. A person who believes they're good at something may interpret even neutral or negative feedback in a favorable light. They'll recall their rare successes more vividly than their failures and will often explain away mistakes as flukes or someone else's fault. Even when we do try to assess ourselves honestly, we're notoriously bad at it. Without clear benchmarks or consistent feedback, people often assume they're above average, a well-documented bias that shows up in everything from driving skills to ethical behavior. Most people think they're more honest than average, more empathetic than average, and more competent than average. Statistically, of course, this can't be true for everyone. As the philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, the problem with the world is that the most confident people are often the least informed, while those with genuine wisdom are filled with doubt. That quote captures the unsettling dynamic at play here. Confidence and competence do not always go hand in hand. The journey of learning follows a predictable pattern that researchers have mapped out in the form of a curve. At the beginning, there's a spike in confidence, what some call Mount Stupid. This is where people know just enough to feel like they understand a topic, but not enough to realize how much they're missing. The view from this hill is deceptively clear. You think you've grasped the big picture, but in truth, you've only skimmed the surface. Then, often abruptly, comes a steep decline into the valley of despair. This is the stage where a learner becomes painfully aware of their limitations. They now understand enough to know how much more there is to learn. Confidence takes a nosedive. Many people abandon the learning process here, discouraged by the realization that their initial grasp was an illusion. But if they keep going, through deliberate practice, honest feedback, and consistent effort, they begin the long climb up the slope of enlightenment. Competence grows slowly, and with it, confidence begins to recover. But this time, it's based on real understanding. Eventually, they reach a stable level, a plateau of informed confidence. They now have both skill and the awareness of its boundaries. Interestingly, even experts, those with real mastery, tend to underestimate their abilities. Because they're so aware of the complexities within their field, they often question their own knowledge more than a novice would. They've seen how deep the rabbit hole goes. They understand how easily one can be wrong. This humility, far from being a flaw, is actually one of the clearest signs of expertise. As physicist Richard Feynman once said, "It's more exciting to live in a state of uncertainty than to cling to answers that might be wrong." That openness to not knowing, that willingness to admit the limits of one's understanding, is what separates true experts from the loud, unqualified voices that so often dominate conversations. Although the Dunning-Kruger effect was first demonstrated in academic settings, its influence reaches far beyond classrooms and test scores. It's a pattern that shows up in boardrooms, hospitals, political debates, and increasingly online spaces where everyone has a microphone. In the workplace, you might find it in the employee who overestimates their contributions or resists feedback. Studies have shown that a majority of managers rank themselves in the top half of their peer group, a mathematical impossibility. These inflated self-perceptions can create tension, reduce team effectiveness, and stall professional development. In medicine, the consequences can be far more serious. Research has shown that less competent medical students often overrate their clinical judgment. This misplaced confidence can lead to risky decisions and a reluctance to consult with more experienced colleagues. One study even found that the doctors most confident in their diagnoses weren't any more accurate than their peers. They were just less likely to ask for help or double-check their conclusions. In political arenas, the loudest voices often come from those with the shallowest understanding. People with limited exposure to complex economic or scientific issues can express absolute certainty in their beliefs, while actual experts carefully hedge their statements and acknowledge uncertainties. This discrepancy can tilt public opinion toward oversimplified or misleading narratives. Nowhere has this dynamic become more apparent than on social media. The internet has given a platform to anyone with an opinion, allowing novice voices to broadcast their views to enormous audiences. While this accessibility has many benefits, it has also contributed to what some scholars call the death of expertise, a cultural shift where all opinions are treated as equally valid, regardless of the qualifications behind them. Social platforms reward confidence. Bold claims and hot takes generate clicks and shares, while careful, nuanced explanations often get buried. Algorithms amplify the loudest voices, not necessarily the most informed ones. As a result, overconfidence is not just tolerated, it's incentivized. The outcome is a kind of informational chaos, where knowing just enough to sound convincing can be more powerful than actually knowing what you're talking about. The Dunning-Kruger effect is not uniform across all cultures, however. In the West, particularly in the United States, individualism and self-promotion are deeply woven into the cultural fabric. Children are taught to believe in themselves and to pursue their dreams with confidence. While this ethos can fuel ambition and creativity, it also sets the stage for inflated self-perceptions. By contrast, in many East Asian cultures, humility and self-awareness are emphasized more heavily. Individuals are often taught to err on the side of modesty, to recognize their shortcomings, and to seek constant self-improvement. In one study, Japanese students regularly rated themselves below average, a stark contrast to the American tendency to overestimate. These cultural influences shape how the Dunning-Kruger effect shows up. Societies that value modesty may produce fewer outward signs of overconfidence. But even in these cultures, the fundamental issue remains. People cannot recognize gaps in their knowledge unless they first have the tools to detect them. No society is immune from the limitations of human cognition. While culture may shape the expression of overconfidence, the root cause, the inability to perceive our own ignorance, is deeply human. It's tempting to think of the Dunning-Kruger effect as someone else's problem, something that afflicts other people, the loud ones in meetings or the overzealous voices online. But the truth is more uncomfortable. This cognitive illusion lives within all of us. It is not a defect exclusive to the ignorant or arrogant. It is a blind spot baked into the way human cognition works. It means we often misjudge not only what we know, but how well we know it. That's what makes this effect so difficult to escape. When you're under its influence, it's not just that you're misinformed. It's that you're misinformed about how misinformed you are. It's a psychological hall of mirrors where your internal compass, the one meant to steer you toward truth, is quietly pointing in the wrong direction. And the scariest part, you won't even feel lost. What makes this even more dangerous in our modern age is the overwhelming accessibility of information. At a glance, it might seem like a gift. Anyone with an internet connection can read articles, watch tutorials, or skim summaries of complex topics. The catch? Information without structure, depth, or context doesn't automatically become knowledge, and it certainly doesn't become expertise. We live in an era where it's easier than ever to get a taste of something and mistake it for a full-course meal. This creates what researchers call knowledge illusion, a belief that just because we've encountered a term or read a paragraph, we understand it. We might know the headline, but not the nuance. The shallow familiarity breeds a false sense of expertise, pushing us up that infamous first peak of the Dunning-Kruger curve before we've even realized that we've taken a step. The design of digital platforms intensifies this problem. Social media isn't built for humility. It thrives on extremes. Algorithms don't reward thoughtfulness. They reward engagement. The more confident and controversial your post, the more people will respond. This feedback loop creates the illusion that boldness equals correctness. A confident novice is more likely to go viral than a cautious expert. And when confidence is mistaken for competence, we begin to confuse noise for wisdom. We've also entered a phase in history where truth itself feels negotiable. We're surrounded by voices claiming authority, often without the qualifications to back them. But the louder someone is, the more they're heard. The more they're heard, the more they appear to be correct. This leads to a social mirage, where the appearance of knowledge substitutes the actual substance of it. This is how the Dunning-Kruger effect escapes the lab and infects our political systems, media consumption, and public discourse. It warps everything from election outcomes to public health debates. It turns complex issues into battlegrounds of half-truths and unchecked assumptions. Consider political engagement. In many democratic nations, people vote on policies that involve deeply intricate systems: economic reform, foreign diplomacy, climate strategies. But many voters assess these with only surface-level understanding, bolstered by unwavering certainty. Ironically, the people most confident in their opinions may be the least equipped to understand the long-term consequences of those policies. This is not a failure of intelligence, but a failure of self-awareness. In the world of business and hiring, similar problems emerge. When companies prioritize candidates who sell themselves well over those who speak thoughtfully and modestly about their skills, overconfidence gets rewarded. This fosters a culture where saying you're qualified becomes more valuable than being qualified. Over time, such cultures begin to reward performative certainty over quiet competence, leading to poor decision-making at the leadership level and a lack of innovation from below. The Dunning-Kruger effect also subtly undermines the foundations of public trust in science. During global crises, such as a pandemic, we saw countless examples of this. Suddenly, everyone with a social media account felt entitled to dispute virologists, epidemiologists, and statisticians. Their sources, misinterpreted articles, cherry-picked data, or influencers repeating half-baked theories. Meanwhile, actual scientists, trained to speak with caution and specificity, often seemed less certain, simply because they understood the complexity of the problem. That irony is at the heart of the Dunning-Kruger problem. Experts aware of their limitations speak in probabilities and grey areas. Non-experts, oblivious to complexity, speak in absolutes. To the untrained ear, the latter sounds more convincing. This erosion of intellectual trust isn't just a cultural problem. It has real-world consequences. It leads to vaccine hesitancy, denial of climate science, rejection of policy expertise, and the elevation of populist rhetoric. It's a phenomenon where passionate ignorance, when amplified enough, drowns out informed guidance. This is why understanding the Dunning-Kruger effect is not just about psychology. It's about survival in a world of endless information and echo chambers. So how do we begin to inoculate ourselves against this invisible threat? The first and perhaps hardest step is admitting that we are not exempt. Intelligence, education, and experience do not guarantee immunity. In fact, sometimes the most confident mistakes come from those who believe they're too smart to be wrong. Psychologist Robert Burton once wrote that the sensation of knowing something feels the same whether or not what you believe is actually true. The brain doesn't offer a warning light when you're wrong. That makes humility not just a virtue, but a necessity. From a practical standpoint, the most effective remedy is feedback, not just from anyone, but from people who understand the field you're trying to navigate. Objective, honest input from those with real experience is one of the few ways to align your perception with reality. But it requires courage, because hearing that you're not as skilled or informed as you thought stings. It threatens your ego. But without that pain, growth doesn't happen. Deliberate practice is another crucial strategy. Repeating a task alone doesn't guarantee improvement. You need targeted effort, reflection, and correction. If you keep repeating the same mistakes without knowing they're mistakes, you don't get better. You just get more confident in your mediocrity. True learning demands that we intentionally seek out where we fall short and work specifically on those areas. Another protective habit is something called metacognitive awareness, learning to think about your own thinking. Asking yourself, how do I know this? What assumptions am I making? What if I'm wrong? These are questions that open the door to humility. They don't weaken your knowledge, they strengthen it by keeping it flexible. And perhaps most importantly, we need to make peace with the idea of uncertainty. In a society addicted to quick answers, admitting "I don't know" can feel like weakness. But in truth, it's one of the clearest signs of intellectual maturity. The greatest thinkers in history, from Socrates to Darwin, understood that real wisdom lies in accepting the vastness of the unknown. Culturally, we need to shift how we reward and recognize expertise. That starts in classrooms, where students should be taught that not knowing something isn't failure, it's the beginning of curiosity. It continues in media, where platforms could spotlight thinkers who are willing to explain complexity rather than those who simplify for the sake of clickbait. And it must reach into institutions where hiring and promotion should favor evidence of learning and adaptability, not just confidence in delivery. It's equally important to understand that a little overconfidence isn't always bad. In fact, a modest belief in your potential can help you take risks, push through challenges, and grow. What separates healthy confidence from the Dunning-Kruger kind is calibration. When your self-belief is rooted in effort, feedback, and reflection, it becomes a tool for progress. When it floats unmoored from actual ability, it becomes a danger. Psychologist Albert Bandura once observed that people who believe they can cope are more resilient in the face of setbacks. They persist longer, recover faster, and ultimately succeed more often. But again, this self-efficacy only works when it's grounded in reality, not illusion. Navigating this balance is not easy. It means walking a tightrope between believing in yourself enough to move forward, but doubting yourself enough to keep learning. Between speaking up and knowing when to listen. Between explaining something and admitting you don't fully understand it yet. And as we do this work in ourselves, we must also be mindful of how we view others. When someone expresses certainty about something they clearly don't understand, it can be infuriating. But the Dunning-Kruger effect reminds us that they may genuinely not know how far off they are. Their overconfidence isn't necessarily arrogance. It's often a blind spot. That doesn't excuse misinformation, but it does invite empathy. We were all beginners once. We've all thought we knew more than we did. We've all had moments when we mistook exposure for expertise. And if we're honest, we'll have those moments again. There's a quote by Feynman that captures this humility beautifully. "I believe that a scientist looking at non-scientific problems is just as dumb as the next guy." Coming from one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, it's a powerful reminder that knowledge in one area does not translate to universal insight. Expertise is not portable. It must be earned again and again in each new domain. And that's perhaps the greatest takeaway from all of this. True mastery, real understanding, does not look like certainty. It looks like curiosity. It sounds like questions. It feels like standing at the edge of what you know and staring into the vastness of what you don't. So the next time you feel completely sure about something, pause. Ask yourself what you might be missing. Listen to those who've spent longer in the field. Be open to correction, and remember that certainty, especially early on, is often a sign that you've barely scratched the surface. Because in the end, the more we learn, the more we discover how much more there is to learn. And that's not a failure of intellect. That's its greatest strength.